Some of us may know them as the nation's fourth seacoast, others as inland seas. But to most of us, they are the Great Lakes. Superior, Huron, Michigan, Ontario, and Erie make up the largest body of fresh water on Earth, accounting for 21% of the surface fresh water on the planet. The surface area of all the Great Lakes combined is 95,160 square miles, which is larger than the state of Texas. These Great Lakes supply fresh water to over 40 million people in the United States and Canada every single day. More than 3,500 species of plants and animals inhabit the Great Lakes Basin. To many of us, they seem perfect, pristine, and limitless. But things have not always been this way, and even now, they continue to face serious threats and an uncertain future.
If you visit American City, you will find it very pretty. Just two things of which you must beware. Don't drink the water and don't breathe the air. Pollution, pollution, they got smog and sewage and mud. Turn on your tap and get hot and cold running crud. See the halibuts and the sturgeons being wiped out by detergents. Fish gotta swim and birds gotta fly, but they don't last long if they try. Pollution, pollution, you can use the latest toothpaste and then rinse your mouth with industrial waste.
It was not too long ago that our rivers and lakes had been turned into urban sewers. Industrial and human waste was recklessly dumped into the once fresh, flowing water.
Rivers caught on fire, aquatic life was disappearing, and Lake Erie was pronounced biologically dead. But not all was lost. People made their voices heard, and the need for regulation and preservation of our environment was recognized.
On December 2nd, 1970, President Richard Nixon signed the law creating the Environmental Protection Agency. This led to the Clean Water Act in 1972, Endangered Species Act in 1973, and from there, various laws and regulation which helped to further protect and restore our environment. We have come a long way since the 1970s, and the progress that we have made in restoring these Great Lakes to their original glory has been immense. But like most things, with new years come new challenges and threats. Invasive species, toxic algal blooms, climate change, water protection rollbacks, the list goes on. Protecting these essential sources of fresh water is an ongoing initiative. We simply can't afford to slide backwards and have history repeat itself. My name is Julia Robson. I've been working in the Great Lakes region for the past 10 years as a biologist and environmental educator. I've seen firsthand the effects of these threats, as well as the positive impacts that have been made by investing in the restoration of the Great Lakes.
My name is Alyssa Armbruster. For my entire life, I have had a passion for conservation and outdoor education, which led me to Milwaukee, where I was able to immerse myself in protecting the Great Lakes region. Since then, I have worked for various local natural resource programs, helping to raise conservation awareness.
When we started seeing everything come out after the election, after the new year, boom, over 30% proposed cuts to the Environmental Protection Agency. Boom, we're gonna roll back regulations protecting clean water. I think when you realize that there's such big threats to something that's so important to your everyday life and the livelihoods of so many people in this region, that of course you'd want to act. And that's exactly what we did.
On August 26, Julia Robson and Alyssa Armbruster left their homes in Milwaukee, Wisconsin to hike 332 miles to the Porcupine Mountains with a project they created called Walk to Sustain Our Great Lakes.
Bringing attention to Great Lakes conservation and conservation issues. The Great Lakes are the largest freshwater system on the entire planet.
I just think we can't afford to backtrack from how far we've come. It takes a long time to get as far as we have. We're able to swim and fish in our lakes, but that might not always be the case, and that hasn't always been the case. Little did we know that this was the start of one of the most epic and educational journeys of our young lives.
Something that would lead us to creating this film that you are watching and inspiring thousands of people to stand up for Great Lakes conservation.
There will be tears, physical agony, snakes, and 5 minutes of fame on Mark Ruffalo's Twitter feed.
So let's start from the beginning.
My father, Gaylord Nelson, the founder of Earth Day, he would be so delighted to see you here. This is the 47th Earth Day. The first Earth Day occurred April 22nd, 1970. And it is an important part of his enduring legacy. And the reason it endures is because of people just like you.
Death and Life of the Great Lakes. This was a book that really inspired Alyssa and I to do the walk, and it's pretty eye-opening. At first, when we knew we wanted to do an awareness project, it wasn't, oh yeah, we're gonna walk 343 miles, that's how we'll do it. No, we knew that it had to be something that people would ask us, why on earth are you doing something like this? Because then it would afford us the opportunity to have that conversation and engage them about these conservation issues and about what they can do to help address them. We decided to host a few short day hikes leading up to our big send-off event. These not only served as practice to prepare our feet for the 15 to 20 miles per day during our trip, but also as an outlet for the community to get involved with understanding and caring about the Great Lakes and the issues that they face.
It is the largest source of fresh water on the planet, and we need water to exist, so why shouldn't we care about protecting the Great Lakes?
People don't realize how important something is until it's gone. So once it's gone, what do? So it's important to speak up for it now, because water doesn't have a voice, but we do.
These lakes are more than their beauty and economic value. This water has history and ultimately connects us all.
We're here today around We Are Water, which is our celebration, our cultural celebration around water. So we try to really engage the community on many different levels around water, around public policy, around education, and then cultural. Because we know and we believe that every culture has a water story.
The original people of this land, being the Menominee, the Potawatomi, the Ojibwe, that's my partner Mark and I, we represent, and that's why we chose that word, miigwech. That is to say, sincere, heartfelt, thank you. Thank you, each of you, for being here, for taking the time, and for loving the water as you do.
And my greetings are for all that was, all that is, and all that ever will be. And in our greetings, we also include the trees and the waters, the ones that live in the sand here, all that was, our ancestors. We think about them. And when I look at the Great Lakes here, I think about my relative water walkers that have gone around and just completed one of their last journeys. And I was reading one of her last writings saying that this was gonna be her last walk.
We have two young women here. They're about to start on their own water walk. From the bottom of my heart, I cannot thank you enough for all of you being here. Truly, it's a great thing to see how so many people love and care about this water. And it transcends economic barriers, people of different backgrounds, all colors of skin. It's really beautiful to see.
You know, because this is life. That's no joke. That's real. Because each of us is made up of this water.
Milwaukee River was a stop on the Underground Railroad for African American slaves. So that river, that water, was a pathway to freedom.
Without that water, we wouldn't be here. And we need to be teaching our children where this water comes from. where we're going. Why is it that it's flowing? What you do here is not unimportant. This is serious business. This is the business of life.
A month is a long time that we're just gonna be walking. Sometimes I think about that and I'm like, we're stopping everything we're doing for a month just to walk. All of the months of prepping, route planning, day hikes, it was all over, and the next chapter was about to begin. Before we knew it, our own water walk was upon us.
For our first steps of a 332-mile journey that we're going to make starting today. We're walking from the turf right here up to the shores of Lake Superior. Anyone is welcome to join us for the first rough mile of our walk. We have 300 plus miles to go after that, but you guys can do the first mile with us. And you're welcome to come for the rest of it if you want. During our walk, we wanted to get first-hand knowledge of the issues the Great Lakes face and trickle-down effects these threats have on the surrounding ecosystem, economy, and communities. So join us as we start this educational adventure. Our first 3 days on the trail were quite an adjustment, not only physically, but mentally as well. Luckily, we had our trail angels, as we like to call them, also known as our family and friends, who picked up our heavy packs and met us at our night camping locations to help ease us into the strenuous journey. Here's our trail angel for the day. Yeah. We got some storms coming, trying to make it to the trailhead before we get rained on. Our feet hurt. We're gonna eat some mac and cheese tonight. We've entered the Kettle Moraine. How are shins doing? My shins are feeling better. I got regular tennis shoes on today, not hiking boots, but I think we'll both can say that the arches aren't high enough in our tennis shoes and we're hurting there, but we're bound to be hurting somewhere.
But while walking inland on the Ice Age Trail for several days, the mental aspect of this endeavor started to kick in. We began to miss seeing Lake Michigan and miss hearing the familiar sound of waves crashing on shore. We found ourselves thinking of our home in Milwaukee and remembering the progress that has been made restoring the waters from what once was, but also the pressing threats that it, as well as many of these lake cities, still face.
I work for a group called Milwaukee Riverkeeper, and our mission is to protect water quality and wildlife habitat in the Milwaukee River Basin. If you look historically back even several decades ago, the Milwaukee River was in much worse shape than it is now. We still do have a lot of problems. We are an old city, relatively speaking, in the Great Lakes, and a lot of our older industrial cities, Chicago, Detroit, Buffalo, we're all in very similar situations where we have very old, failing sewers. Our biggest issues that we see are really bacteria. A lot of that is coming from failing sewers that are sending bacteria to the waterways.
We've found some areas of the Menominee River that are very high in bacteria, about 1,000 times higher than we'd expect based on our models. And we started testing in 2008 every single pipe that went into the river in about a 10-mile section of the Menominee. And we found about half of those are discharging human waste to the rivers. And those pipes really should just have rain and snow melt. We have these 100-year storms we talk about, and statistically that means that there's a 1% chance in any given year that you'd have that type of a storm event. And we've had about 8 of them in the last 15 years, so they're no longer this rare event. They're becoming more and more of a common event. You know, our sewers aren't set up to deal with that amount of water. So what often happens is that you have cities that have to, open up their sewers and start discharging raw waste to the rivers. It really just shows that we have very old pipes, they're failing. We often ignore them because they're under the ground. It's harder to ignore the bridges and the roads, but it's a lot easier to ignore the sewers. But that is going to be a huge challenge for us with climate change. And it's also, super important to remember that this whole river drains to Lake Michigan, which is obviously the source of our drinking water supply. And not only for the 1 million people in Milwaukee that drink out of the lake, but, we have about 40 million Americans and Canadians that drink from the Great Lakes. I think there's going to be a lot of talk about infrastructure in the next few years. I mean, we've been talking about it for a long time, but our country needs to get really serious about investing in infrastructure, not only in the Great Lakes area, but in the entire country. The GLRI in particular, which started in 2010, it really started under the Bush administration, and then Obama kind of pushed it forward. But it really brought a lot of money to the Great Lakes states that allowed us to clean up a lot of these legacy projects that we called them, which had just been on lists for years, but no one had funding to clean them up.
The Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, or GLRI for short, provides much-needed funding for various restoration projects throughout the entire Great Lakes region, including the removal of toxic sediment in our waterways left over from the manufacturing and industrial era. It continues to be the largest investment in the Great Lakes in nearly 2 decades.
In about 2008, we started doing some dredging a little bit downstream of here. We were able to remove a lot of contaminated sediment, several 100,000 cubic yards of contaminated sediment, which had things like PCBs and PAHs, which are essentially carcinogenic kind of industrial compounds. And so we removed about 70% of the known contamination in the Milwaukee River with those. There were 3 different projects. It looks really great now. Vegetation's finally starting to come back in. It's just been a really phenomenal success. And so it ended up being about a $50 million project with all 3 phases combined. And roughly about 65% of that was paid by the federal government, with the rest of it largely being paid by state. The PCBs never really break down. They just kind of get buried by other sediment on top of them. And so cleaning them up can take decades of just really planning and science and really bringing the money together for the projects. But the Little Menominee Rivers had PAHs. That project took 37 years to clean up. So it's probably people's whole lifetimes to clean up that one Superfund site. And we still know that, that was cleaned up to certain federal guidelines, not completely cleaned up. So in some cases, it can inhibit, additional restoration projects that we would really like to see.
The Little Menominee River is just one example of a body of water that is classified as a Superfund site. A Superfund site is an area which contains toxic contamination that requires extensive, long-term cleanup.
It's kind of the biggest impact for the community is that people are most likely to get these contaminants via fish that they eat from the river. We did find about 14% of the fish that were tested that were mostly white suckers had basically tumors, kidney tumors. But it was telling us that a lot of our fish basically had cancer from a lot of these historic contaminant levels. I think the big lesson for a lot of this is when we talk to people is that, it's really important to keep the contamination out of the river. In the first place, because once it's in there, it is so expensive to take out.
According to the EPA's National Priority List, there are over 1,100 Superfund sites spread across the United States. 430 of those are located within the 8 states that make up the Great Lakes region alone. Nearly 50 million people live within a 3-mile radius of one of these sites.
Sure, we're at the Sheboygan Harbor. In the background you see Blue Harbor Resort. That was a redevelopment that took place in the city back in the mid-2000s. Prior to what you see now, it used to be a coal yard and had tanks for oil and storing whatever else you store in those kinds of things. They started to do testing, and sure enough, there was PCBs in the river, PAHs in other areas. Back in 1986, the 14 miles from Sheboygan Falls to the harbor were classified as a Superfund site. So, over the years, that was a black eye in the community. People, you might turn green if you go swim in the water type of thing. Trying to invite people to revitalize the harbor area or other neighborhoods that are on the river, it was difficult, because who wants to invest large sums of money next to a Superfund site? So we dredged out over 400,000 cubic yards of material that, to put it in a local perspective, that would fill Lambeau Field up to about the 45th row. Qualitatively speaking, I would say, there's been a definite uptick. There's been a number of additional buildings that have gone in along the riverfront here as part of the brownfield redevelopment. There's a big apartment complex that chose South Pier, and I question whether or not any of that would have been done if we still had the stigma of, we're still a Superfund site, but we're on our way to cleaning it up, so.
Fox River State Trail.
Here we go.
20 miles today. First day back with our big packs on.
20 miles and 20 pounds.
20 miles and 20 pounds.
More like 30 pounds. When you think about the Great Lakes, they're not just large bodies of water. The rivers, streams, climate, plants, aquatic life, each play their part in this fragile ecosystem. Similar to the human body, we are each made up of organs, veins, bones, muscles, blood, each playing their individual role in keeping us alive and functioning, while still working as one unit. If one organ fails, it can have an effect on the rest of the body and how it functions.
The Great Lakes have been plagued with a multitude of issues over the years, from polluted rivers and streams to climate change and invasive species, each having an effect on everything that makes up the Great Lakes ecosystem and how it works.
These lakes are not just driven by the weather of this region, they're not just driven by what happens in the watersheds, but the way these lakes work is driven by the types of animals and plants that you have in the lakes. A lot of invasive species that have come into the Great Lakes Basin. We have over 180 in the Great Lakes Basin. A lot of those are relatively benign. They come here, they exist, but they don't have a huge impact on the system. The ones that have a huge impact are the ones that come in and find a niche that has not yet been exploited. And zebra and quagga mussels are a great example of that. Before they arrived here, there was no organism that could reproduce as fast as they do and that lived by filter feeding on the bottom of the lake.
The term invasive species means a type or species of organism that is not native to a specific location and is known to cause ecological or economic harm to its new environment. You might wonder, how did they even get here?
The Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence have long been important waterways, but now they have been linked into one great water highway, reaching from the Atlantic Ocean 2,300 miles into the heart of the North American continent.
The St. Lawrence Seaway is a man-made system of locks, channels, and canals that was completed in 1959. The Seaway allows cargo ships from the Atlantic Ocean to pass through and access the various city ports within the Great Lakes region. This opened up the ability to transport goods to and from America's heartland, which created booming growth for the economy of the Midwest. But what it also did was open the doorway for invasive species to inhabit our Great Lakes by hitching a ride in and on these ocean-going vessels. These ships take in a mixture of seawater, also known as ballast water, that is filled with different species of aquatic life when loading and dumping their cargo, and, unbeknownst to them, travel those species into the freshwater systems of the Great Lakes through the St. Lawrence Seaway.
Now Lakers carry iron ore from west or east to the steel mills of the Great Lakes. And from Lake Superior, wheat goes right through to ports like Montreal. Now, deep-sea ships can sail directly across the oceans of the world to lake ports where they have never been before.
The St. Lawrence Seaway continues to be a very important mode of shipping and receiving goods for the Great Lakes region.
The mussels first would appear near all the ports. The ballast water was the transport mechanism. And then eventually they attached to recreational boats and everything else.
It is hard to kind of get your head around an organism being a form of pollution, but it absolutely is. You know, all it takes is one species and you can totally foul things up like the quagga mussel has.
Now you have an organism in the system doing something that no organism before it was doing within the system. And that has changed the way the system works. So the big question is, how have the lakes changed in response to the mussels? In the past, we've had models, mathematical models, that would tell us, for example, how much plankton you could expect to go in the lake if you knew how much phosphorus was going into the lake. Those models don't work anymore. And that's because mussels have changed the rules of the game. So one of the goals of our research now is to try to determine how do the lakes work and what is the new response to things like, for example, phosphorus loading. If you put this much phosphorus into Lake Michigan, this is how much plankton you're going to have in Lake Michigan. And ultimately, if you have this much plankton in Lake Michigan, this is how much fish you're going to have in Lake Michigan.
These issues not only directly affect the lakes and the life in those lakes, they also affect the economy that surrounds them. More than 1.5 million jobs are tied directly to the Great Lakes, accounting for $62 billion in wages.
I think that's why there's support for restoring the Great Lakes, is that people do understand that the lakes support a huge economy here in the Midwest.
I always like to tell people in Wisconsin, I mean, we have an $8 to $12 billion water-based recreation industry here, and it is such a huge part of our quality of life in Wisconsin and a huge part of our economy. And arguably, after dairy, maybe and cranberries, you know, water-based tourism is a very big industry for people in this state. You know, if you think of everybody who rents boats, rents hotels, has restaurants and places where people come to recreate on the water, in the water. There's been studies done by Brookings and other institutions that for every $1, you know, we spend in Great Lakes restoration, we get $2 in benefits to our economy.
When I worked at the state level in the late 80s, I think we were up at around $5 billion in money that came out of our fishing industry for Wisconsin. I think we're down to about $880 million in fishing industry revenue that comes from the state now because of all the invasives and the overfishing that have really cost us that livelihood for thousands of people and billions of dollars to the state fund. So if there's anything, we have to start demonstrating to people that this is what happens if you don't do the right thing right off the bat. This is the cost. And I think the difficulty in prevention is that people don't really equate and show the cost. Once you start doing that, you get a lot of people who turn and say, wow, I never realized that. Well, how many jobs are in $4 billion? There's a lot of them. You know, how much revenue, what can that do for us? For our school system or for anything. And I think that that's what we have to start doing is showing how these things are relative.
Dad started fishing mainly got a trawler to fish chubs in '62. And then the chubs went away and the alewife started. This is where we used to put our alewife. We used to have it this high all the way up to the front, all the way around.
Full alewife?
Full.
Wow.
Yeah. The fishery in the lakes has changed. You know, there used to be enough alewife to go out there and catch, but then there was too many PCBs in the alewife. So then that went to hell because you can't feed PCBs for human food and stuff. So then we went smelt fishing, and we were doing real well with that too. But pretty soon there was no smelt, just like the alewife. You know, there's nothing out there anymore. quagga mussels was the biggest problem.
Yeah.
When the mussels came in, you know, that's our biggest problem right now, I think, is the mussel problem. And that's like you've seen on there where we set those. Yeah, they get filled with them, and the bottom, it tears the twine because it's so fine.
Right.
It wrecks those nets quite a bit. That's why patching, it's a steady job fixing nets.
Is that what you're doing in there?
Yeah.
Patching? Mainly because of zebra, like quagga mussel tears?
Yeah.
How much is the net like that cost? I mean, how much is
Probably
that cost?
around $400 to $500 now.
Yeah.
I mean, you used to have like 10 boats out of Milwaukee and 2 or 3 boats out of Port Washington. Sheboygan had 6 or 7 boats. Racine had a couple. Kenosha had a couple. There's nobody anymore. It's got to change. Otherwise, there's going to be no fish. I think it would have been fine. Everything would have been just fine if we could have kept these mussels out.
Each year, millions of state and federal dollars are spent on invasive species management and control.
A good example of invasive species control is the sea lamprey, which has been reduced to about 10% of its peak population in the Great Lakes.
Sea lampreys are an invasive species that traveled into Lake Superior and Lake Michigan in the early 1920s.
The sea lampreys attach themselves to native freshwater fish, draining their nutrients and rapidly killing them.
Their growth exploded in the 1950s and caused a world of hurt for the Great Lakes fishing industry until controls were put in place to reduce their populations, similar to what the zebra and quagga mussels are doing now. However, a big difference is that the mussels are nearly impossible to control once they have arrived.
Right now, most people that are concerned about controlling or managing an invasive are primarily thinking, how could we possibly control or manage the mussels? Because those are an ecosystem architect that have changed the entire food web. But you totally forget that there are still sea lampreys out there in the lake, and their control efforts are extremely important to maintaining the sport fishery for trout and salmon. There's still millions of restoration money that's being spent both chemically treating streams, physically removing them, maintaining barriers to stop lampreys from passing upstream so that they're more easily managed. People tend to think the Great Lakes have moved past the sea lamprey as a threat, but it's always there in the background.
I mean, definitely, slowing down or stopping new invasive species is the most cost-effective, method, because, once they are here, we either have to pay a lot. Sea lamprey control, it works, but it also costs millions, $25 million a year. So that's a lot of money that could have been going to something else, but now we, have to manage it. Paying up front to deal with these pathways, it has a cost, but if we look at sort of the big impacts to the Great Lakes and the types of actual dollar value, places like water intakes and power plants, they're spending lots of money every day to keep their water flowing because of the mussels. And so sure, it costs money to stop these things ahead of time, but it usually costs a lot more to deal with it down the road.
I mean, I do think it's important, if we are going to spend hundreds of millions of dollars a year, that we also get on board with tougher laws, because spending money is easier sometimes than passing tough laws. And the analogy that somebody once used to explain the situation to me was, it's like a lung cancer patient. Yeah, you want to get them chemo or her, and you want to get this person stabilized and on the road to recovery, but also you want them to stop smoking. And we haven't done that yet.
You got a red-bellied snake.
Yeah, northern red-bellied snake. Looking nummy.
Smelling just as good. Our tent set up. Peanut butter and Day 11, full of rain. Blisters, wet feet, more rain.
Alyssa is trooping through some blisters right now.
Wet feet equals blisters.
Yep.
Look at that blister.
Oh my god.
So pretty!
Ooh, look at this view. Oh, that's so pretty.
Green Bay is an interesting system because at one end you have the Fox River, which at one time was one of the most heavily industrialized rivers in the world. Lots of paper mills, etc. And prior to the Clean Water Act, water quality in the Fox River was horrible. Now the water quality in the Fox River has increased dramatically, but there's still a tremendous amount of stuff that's washing off the land. The one thing the Clean Water Act did was a very good job on paper mills and sewage treatment plants, but didn't do much at all about what's known as non-point source. So that's the stuff that runs off city streets and farm fields. That's still a major problem, and that's a major source of what's coming down the river today.
Non-point source pollution, so stuff that runs off the land and goes into the rivers and streams that eventually feed into the Great Lakes. That can be anything from phosphorus on our farm fields, manure from cows, or things that we're putting on our lawns.
Green Bay and Saginaw Bay are probably two of the hot spots for blue-green algae problems, but Western Basin of Lake Erie has had issues for years.
There kind of was a crisis already in Toledo. I mean, that was kind of a Cuyahoga moment as far as, grabbing the public's attention.
On the morning of August 2nd, 2014, residents of Toledo were abruptly told not to drink, bathe, or cook with their tap water, and that boiling it would make it more toxic. This was due to a harmful algal bloom on Lake Erie, where the toxin microcystin got through the water treatment systems and into the tap water supply. Nearly 500,000 people could not use their tap water for 3 days, which left them having to use bottled water or drive hours to find another source.
Every year, Lake Erie continues to have large toxic algal blooms due to excessive agricultural and urban runoff. The toxins don't get into the water supply each year like they did in 2014, but it's a lingering concern for those who rely on Lake Erie for drinking water.
If you can't safely drink the water, coming out of your tap, which is coming from the lake, I don't know what could be more impaired or considered more impaired. You don't want people to get sick ever. That's why we have these regulatory agencies in place. That's why we do science. That's why we should listen to the people doing the science.
Land use in the watershed. So if you don't know what a watershed is, basically that's the land surrounding a lake. Whenever you get rainfall, all that land drains into that lake. Because of this land use, we are getting more nutrients into Lake Erie than all the other Great Lakes.
When you think of the word nutrients, normally we think of them as being a good thing. Our bodies need nutrients from the food that we eat to grow strong and stay healthy. Farms need nutrients from the fertilizers applied to their soil to grow crops. Our lakes and aquatic life are no different. However, too much of this can cause an imbalance in the ecosystem. This imbalance can create an overgrowth of harmful blue-green algae, also known as cyanobacteria, that feed off the excess nutrients that drain into the rivers and the lakes.
Okay? That nutrients is coming from us, people, when we flush our toilets or run our dishwashers or run our washing machines. It's coming from the fertilizers that we apply to our field, and it's coming from the animals that are living on that landscape. So we have a lot of nutrients into the system. And because that lake is so small relative to the other Great Lakes, if you have lots of nutrients and lots of sunlight, you have the potential for these blooms. Now there are places in some of these other Great Lakes like Saginaw Bay and then Green Bay up in Wisconsin. Those bays within those Great Lakes have huge algal blooms like us. We call them harmful algal blooms, but that word algae is a very generic word. That just because the water's green does not mean it's toxic. It depends on what time of year it is, and it depends on what organism is there. We start to get the presence of green algae. As the name implies, these are the ones that you see that make the water green in color. None of these have toxic producing capabilities. When you get into late summer, the greens start to decline. They don't disappear totally, they start to decline, and the blue-green algae start to show up. They're called blue-green algae, but if you look at their genetics, they're actually a form of bacteria. This generic grouping or kind of blue-green algae, also known as cyanobacteria, there are hundreds of species that don't produce toxins. Okay? So I wish, if we could go back in time, I wish we weren't calling these harmful algal blooms, because when people hear algae, they think green and they think toxin. I wish we could go back and call them harmful cyanobacteria blooms.
So today, one of the things at Green Bay we've been studying for the last several years, Jerry and myself and others, are looking at what's known as seasonal hypoxia. What happens is, and this is true of all lakes, when the surface water warms up in the summertime, warm water is less dense, is lighter than cold water. And what happens is the lake will stratify, so you get this layer of warm water over a layer of cold water. That layer of warm water, and it won't mix, there's a very steep gradient between the two, and as a result, that sort of seals that bottom water off from the atmosphere. So whatever oxygen is present in that cool bottom water has basically got to last until the lake cools down and remixes in the fall. So as that stratified period gets longer, which is one of the predictions for warming conditions, or if the amount of material which is falling out of the water column increases, for example, the amount of algal blooms and stuff. So when that stuff sinks to the bottom, it consumes oxygen. And what happens in Green Bay and Lake Erie and other places is that there's not enough oxygen held in that bottom water to last that whole summer. And so it gradually gets lower and lower until, in some cases, there's you've probably heard of dead zones, like in the Gulf of Mexico, well, or in Lake Erie. Well, Green Bay suffers the same dead zone phenomena here during the summertime. Ultimate driver of that is what's coming off the landscape. So our region is generally projected to be both wetter and warmer. That stratified period gets longer, which is one of the predictions for warming conditions. But that wetter is projected to come in more intense rain events. So that intensity increases, then the potential for additional runoff increases.
And if your lakes are warming up, you know that your climate is warming up. And we have irrefutable data that show that the lakes are warming up.
It's those big rain events which actually drive non-point source loading.
We can show that 80 to 90% of the loading, meaning the movement of the nutrients from the land into the water, happens 10 to 20% of the time. It's happening in these pulsed events, okay? And so when we get these heavy storm events, it's carrying those nutrients in during these very tiny windows of time.
What things will look like when you haven't already been in that situation. We've never experienced the lakes as warm as they are now, so we don't have good examples or good models to say how they're going to respond.
There's this idea that if we stop saying the words climate change, people will just, it'll all go back. You can call it whatever you want, you can ignore it as long as you want, but the fact is, it's going to catch up to us.
And then again, trying to, for example, predict what's going to happen in the future, either with invasive species coming into the Great Lakes, or as we continue to change the way that we use land in the watersheds, the way we do agriculture. We can only predict that by understanding the systems through the scientific research that we do. If we stop doing that research, managers will be left without any tools or the information that they need to make wise decisions about how do you manage the watershed. Should we make any changes in agricultural methods? Do we have to make changes to how we treat sewage? Are there contaminants or toxins that we weren't aware of before, but now are new toxins in the system that are affecting the health of both the fish in the system and the people who drink the water and eat the fish from that system?
When it comes to non-point, we're all part of this problem, right? So it's everybody who owns property, or owns a home, or a farm, or anything. The farmers and people in agriculture recognize that that the health of the soil is important, and they don't want to lose nutrients because that helps them grow their crops. So people are looking at different techniques, and there's several efforts in the Green Bay watershed, particularly in agriculture, that are very promising. Different technologies and different ways of doing things that both can save the farmer money and also can protect the environment.
And it isn't an all or nothing thing. We can still have corn and we can have clean water. We just need to be smarter about how we're managing those sensitive lands around the lakes, because what happens on the land ends up in the lakes.
You know, because there's a lot of pressure on the farmers. It's like, hey, that's where most of it's coming from. You know, we're seeing 85 to 90% of phosphorus coming non-point sources. But the farmer, like, give me a solution that I know works.
While hiking through Wisconsin, it's hard not to pass a farm or two every few miles. Family farms line the landscape in most of our rural communities. They are a huge part of our way of life in Wisconsin and throughout the Midwest. When we talk about the issues our Great Lakes are facing, we have to remember these family farms have challenges of their own. As much as we need clean air and water, we need the farming community to be able to succeed and prosper as well.
As we passed through Green Bay and made our way up to Michigan, we were reminded of a few different people we met with, researchers and farmers that were partnering together to find solutions to agricultural runoff while still supporting the needs of the farmers and their businesses.
Well, I'm Brent Peterson. I'm with the Farm Demos Network. So what we're doing is we're trying to implement a battery of practices that aren't traditionally tried. They're different than the conventional practices. Really what the project is about is it's about soil health. So we want to look at that. We want to try and increase our infiltration. And in turn, with the increase of infiltration, we're hoping that we get less runoff with that. So we're trying to keep all the moisture and all the nutrients on the field here to begin with. You know, conventional practices have probably been around for 80 years, maybe even 100 years. The old way is to go out here and till the soil and till it once or twice here in the spring, plant the crop, and then when we harvest it later on, then they work the ground again. So what we're trying to do is we're trying not to work the ground at all, if at all possible. So in this system, we're asking them to let the biology do the tillage for them, ultimately, and create the glues in the soil called glomalin, and the glues will hold that soil together. When we work the soil here in this area, we destroy that glomalin. So when we get raindrop impact, and then everything starts moving and running off into the streams. So what we have them do is we have them plant. So if they take corn silage off, we ask them that they put a cover crop in following that. So we plant the cover crop right away, and then we give it a couple weeks, and then we'll make our manure application in there. So then we've got that living crop actually absorbing that manure and putting it into the green growth. Right. And it'll hold it. It's a lot more stable going into the winter months here as well. And then as time goes on, once we hit spring and that cover crop dies off, then it'll slowly release it back to the crop again. You know, if what they say is true, you know, we should see bigger storms ultimately. So that means more raindrop impact. And if we've got fields that don't have any kind of protection, like the cover that we saw in that previous field, we're probably kind of asking for it here a little bit. You know, with the climate change thing, you know, the other side of this is the carbon cycle. So if we can capture more of that carbon and leave it in the soil, you know, when we work the soil, the bacteria absolutely go bananas and they release a lot of carbon into the system. So what we want to do with the covers is we want to capture more of that and hold it, kind of like trees do. You know, trees hold more carbon. So the more carbon that we can hold in the soil, and if we don't disturb the soil, it's just going to keep building. And then when our organic matters are rising, that means we're capturing more carbon, right?
There are jobs and revenue brought into the state by agriculture. That industry is critically important for the state. And so as we move to a solution to this problem, decreasing the algal blooms and their associated toxins, we need to do so in a manner that keeps the ag industry robust in the state. Farmers, you know, are trying to manage their crops and take care of their land the way they can so they can make a profit, but they're not trying to do it at the expense of somebody else. So really the idea is, outside of formalized classroom learning, is to get stakeholder groups up here and really just kind of show them the science and what we're doing and the state of the lake and what we can do to help protect the lake. And so this was a great opportunity. We had a bunch of farmers that contacted us and said they want to know more about the issues and how they can be part of the solutions. And so we open up our doors and our vessels and we spend the day just kind of talking about what we know, what we don't know, and how they can help us.
These lakes have such complex ecosystems that even the smallest changes can have an enormous trickle-down effect. So many things play a part in creating these issues we see on our rivers and lakes today.
It wasn't just as simple as a bad chemical in the water. It's how all the things are interacting.
It really all became aggravated when the zebra mussels moved in. I mean, before that, we've always had algae blooms on the lakes, but the mussels altered the dynamics between the nutrients and the type of algae, and that's when the blue-greens began to become more dominant.
Invasive species are, and quagga mussels specifically, are part of the problem in the western basin of Lake Erie with this toxic algae problem that, knocked out the drinking water to 500,000 people.
The explanation for that is that the mussels, which filter so much algae, are selective, as Bud mentioned, and then so they select out smaller green algae, which is more palatable and it's more nutritious for them. And
they leave them.
They spit back out the large blue-green algae cells, and then they can't even be toxic too.
As our climate changes, we have more intense and frequent rainstorms. With these storms, we get a lot of water in a short amount of time. This not only increases flooding, but it increases the amount of nutrient runoff from the surrounding landscape into the nearby rivers and lakes. The runoff of nutrients into the lakes, or nutrient load, becomes overwhelming and throws the entire ecosystem off balance. And so, the toxic trickle-down effect begins. The increase in nutrients creates more algae production. The algae serve as more food for invasive zebra and quagga mussels. These invasive mussels filter the water by consuming the green, non-toxic algae. This water filtering ultimately makes the lakes clearer, which allows more sunlight to reach greater depths of the lake, creating the perfect environment for an overgrowth of blue-green algae. This overgrowth, or algal bloom, can not only create problems for aquatic life, but can potentially release harmful toxins into the water, such as microcystin, which can be deadly to animals and cause long-term health issues in humans. These algal blooms can also alter the oxygen levels in the lakes dramatically, creating dead zones where no oxygen is present and aquatic life cannot survive.
Changes to the ecosystem affect everything from the smallest plant or insect to the animals feeding along the shore.
Millions of migratory birds depend on the Great Lakes as a stopover habitat to feed and seek refuge during their yearly migration every spring and fall.
Many eat the insects, fish, and mussels in and around the waterways, essentially taking in whatever was in the lakes.
These water bodies are also home to nearly 300 native species of birds who nest and raise their young in the Great Lakes watershed every year. So everything that affects these lakes ultimately affects everything that depends on them.
For thousands of years, birds have used the western shoreline of Lake Michigan as a real prominent migratory flyway. We know just within the time period that we were doing offshore surveys, we experienced one of those polar vortices, and we had huge ice buildup on the west shoreline of Lake Michigan, and actually more than 85% of the lake was frozen. That had a huge impact on diving waterfowl that were in the Great Lakes at that time, and many thousands of birds either starved or just died because they were frozen out. Obviously, that's not something that happens every year, but we don't know whether climate change might actually even set up the conditions for more polar vortex conditions to occur than had occurred in the past. There's a really prominent number of waterfowl species, some in particular, the long-tailed duck. We know that diving ducks feed on some of those underwater mussels that are not native to the Great Lakes, but those mussels actually are really efficient filter feeders that pick up contaminants in some places, which can have long-term effects on those waterfowl. As far as all of the answers, we're far from having all of the answers about, how those organisms and a host of other organisms that use the Great Lakes are affected by this really changing ecology because of invasive species, changing water quality, pollution. The list is as long as your arm.
So this is a female red-winged blackbird, and this is a species that's very closely associated with our waterways here on the Milwaukee River. They nest right next to the rivers typically, usually in reed canary or cattail wetlands. So the health of their young and the health of the adults is very closely tied to water quality. Now she's gonna go back to her babies. She's done mowing.
Be free.
This is not what we were expecting. She's just going corn dog on my fingers. You see that?
The Cat Island chain is a group of small islands that were washed away in the 1970s by high water levels and waves. They are currently being restored to protect the shallow waters and coastal wetlands of Green Bay, which provide critical habitat to many native plants, fish, and birds.
The island was, it was built one truckload of stone and dirt at a time. Funding comes through a combination of grants. The Great Lakes Restoration Initiative grants provided some of the funding. The idea by the environmentalists in the area was to try to reestablish the protective barrier that that island provided for the backwater areas of the lower Green Bay. Those islands help protect a lot of the emergent vegetation, which in turn provided a lot of wildlife habitat and fish habitat for the lower bay. All that vegetation that gets reestablished will help to filter some of that runoff water that does come through the tributaries that feed the area. Some birds need islands and nest on island habitat. So today, there's a common tern nesting platform that has been put in place that the terns have been using now for the past 3 years since the islands have been put out here. 1 year basically of the material being in place here to have, piping plovers and a federally endangered species show up basically within the first couple of years of the project. That was just incredible. So, when we had native vegetation, things worked. One species would go away, and then when the water would go out, the seeds were there, and the native vegetation would come back. And, it's a dynamic ecosystem, and it functions like that. But now with invasives, it's a whole different ballgame. So, we really need to manage things these days to have quality habitat.
It is a hot, buggy 20-miler today. How you feeling, Jer?
Tired. That hill sucks.
It's just staying in one spot. There's no breeze.
No. Be nice if
we get 85 degrees in September.
Yeah, we have an easy day today after our brutal 20-something miler yesterday.
Yesterday, personally, was the worst day we've had so far.
It was pretty hot and buggy, but not awful. The rain was a little bit nice. And then today is a nice 14-miler, 12-miler, whatever, into Bergland.
Yep.
Hey everyone, Alyssa and I have just over 100 miles left before we reach the Porcupine Mountains on Lake Superior next week, Tuesday.
How you feeling?
She's feeling pretty good. It was good to have made it to Michigan. I can't believe we walked to Michigan.
I know.
It feels good. Feet hurt, obviously, but
kind of gotten to the point where our feet are gonna hurt as much as they do for the rest of the time.
Say hi. Hi. A lot of hills today. Look at this spring. Oh my God, it's so clear. Ah. Oh, I want to swim in it. How neat is that? Pretty neat.
This is all of the days of directions that we've had. This is all that's left. 5 more days.
While nearing the end of our month-long journey, being away from water on tap for days at a time and relying on the rivers and lakes for our water gave us new appreciation for how we use water in our daily lives. Over 780 million people don't have access to clean drinking water throughout our world. In the United States, it often appears that most of our population easily takes our water supply for granted. Most of us don't even think about where our water comes from, or what would happen if it suddenly stopped being available. The Wisconsin city of Waukesha has made the local news the past few years with their drinking water-related issues. Due to years of overpumping by several municipalities, the underground aquifer that Waukesha draws its drinking water from was getting depleted at a rate faster than it was being replenished. In addition to this, their wells were contaminated with the element radium, which had leaked into the groundwater supply, thus creating a need for Waukesha to either find a solution to the problem or find another drinking water source. This ultimately led Waukesha to applying for a highly controversial water diversion from Lake Michigan.
Water diversion refers to the removal or transfer of water from one watershed to another.
Well, Waukesha is not in compliance with the radium standard, so they are in violation. We are able to provide, like on a day like today, where we're providing compliant water. It's on the days when there's higher use that we run out of radium compliant water and we have to turn on non-compliant wells. And when we were going through this and looking at it, what we identified was that the aquifer that we pull our water from was actually declining and was at a rate where it was going down and it wasn't sustainable for the long term.
The Great Lakes Basin, or Great Lakes Watershed, refers to the lands directly bordering the lakes, where the surface runoff from rainstorms goes directly back into the lakes. The cities and towns inside the basin get their drinking water from one of the Great Lakes.
If you look at the Great Lakes Basin, and you look at the bowl that sits around the Great Lakes, where if the rain drops in the bowl, it goes into the Great Lakes. Outside of the bowl, you're outside of the Great Lakes. Well, we're outside the bowl.
The water diversion for Waukesha was controversial because at the time there had never been a city outside of the Great Lakes Basin to take diverted water from one of the lakes since the creation of the Great Lakes Compact in 2008.
I think, we have the Great Lakes Compact, which goes a long way to protecting massive diversions out of the basin, but, the thirstier places get, the more pressure there'll be to maybe soften that compact. And I used to think that it was really unrealistic that we would ever be able to move an appreciable amount of water out of the lakes until I started doing some research on pipelines coming into the lakes. And we're moving a river of oil from Alberta into Superior, Wisconsin, and that stuff is thick as glue. And if we can move that distance, we can move something as liquid as water as well. Probably easier.
The Great Lakes Compact is a formal agreement made up of the 8 states that border the Great Lakes: Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Minnesota, New York, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, and the 2 Canadian provinces, Ontario and Quebec. The compact was established in order to regulate and protect the water in these watersheds, defend the Great Lakes against any unnecessary water diversions, and provide sustainable use of the Great Lakes to ensure their viability for future generations.
And one of my biggest arguments in this whole thing is you're creating a precedent. So if 120 plus other communities which are looking at doing the same thing don't return the water, or as has been asked of us on numerous occasions, that we ship water out to Arizona, then what does that mean to the Great Lakes? Well, there's two things I can guarantee you. Number one, we're gonna have a lot of beachfront here, and it might go past the jetties for all we know. But number two, if we don't have control over it, then do we look like an Aral Sea soon? Where everybody kept wondering why it kept getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, and now it's really, really tiny? Well, it's because they tapped into the lake, started using it for their crops. That precedent setting is the thing that is really damaging.
Depending on who you ask, people have different opinions about whether they think Great Lakes water could ever be used in faraway places, such as out west or in other countries. While it may now be somewhat protected under the Great Lakes Compact, it wasn't always, and almost experienced a very large diversion in 1998 called the NOVA Proposal out of Canada. The proposal was to ship 158 million gallons per year of Lake Superior water overseas to Asia in tankers. The idea was to create a global market for Great Lakes water. It was immediately met with pushback with the argument of setting an international precedence.
Waukesha was the first to apply for a water diversion outside of the basin and was granted approval for 8.2 million gallons of water per day with a return of around the same. Next came Foxconn, a private Taiwanese manufacturing company that was originally supposed to make LCD screens but has since backtracked on that idea. Regardless, they set up shop in southeastern Wisconsin, outside of the Great Lakes Basin, and got approved for a water diversion of 7 million gallons per day, but only returning around half of it back through wastewater treatment into the Root River. So, there are a lot of questions we have to ask ourselves as we look to the future.
Will the Great Lakes Compact be able to withstand the demand for water over time?
Are we prepared to deal with the impacts of invasive species and climate change on our Great Lakes? Have we arrived at a tipping point with rollbacks of environmental regulations that will undo the years of progress in restoring these essential bodies of water?
Are we on the verge of repeating history and allowing industries to pollute our rivers and lakes once again?
Is the worth of water becoming lost?
People use water as if there's, be going on forever and ever and ever. Ask the people of Flint, ask the people of Toledo, ask the people of Grand Rapids what it's like when you can't turn on your water. Problem is that as long as you can turn on your water, people don't seem to care.
It's nice that we don't have flammable rivers anymore and that we have, air that we can breathe and we don't have smog. And a lot of that is because of these, these really important laws that we have, and they're still at risk because there are a lot of people that find it inconvenient to get permits to protect waterways, and to protect, ephemeral streams and to protect wetlands. But 1 in 3 people in Wisconsin are dependent on drinking water that originates in those sources. So if people want clean drinking water, it's vitally important to protect all of those types of waterways. And so that's the message that really needs to get out there is that, there's permitting. Sometimes we need to slow down our projects and make sure that we're doing good planning. But it's really about protecting our drinking water.
People were afraid of, all the pollution controls that came with the Clean Water Act. And, regulations aren't a bad thing if they're uniformly applied. They level the playing field for everybody. And the important thing is you got to start out with the premise that these waters don't belong to the industries. They belong to everybody. And it only makes sense that they're used to a degree. I mean, we need jobs, we need food, we need stuff. But equally, we need safe, clean water and air. And we've shown since the early 70s that they're not mutually exclusive. And I don't know why anybody would think that something's changed since then.
The long run is you have clean water because you had a Clean Water Act. You have clean air because you had a Clean Air Act. It wasn't going to happen because of the private sector. It just wasn't. Because if it would have, they'd have done it decades before that. They did it because they were forced to do it. We have a better country, we have a better world because of those 2 acts that were implemented.
Regulation gets a bad name in certain contexts, but there's a reason for those regulations. And it's because certain people were doing things that were bad.
When I started working here 14 years ago-ish in Wisconsin, we had really strong bipartisan support for protecting water. from Republicans and Democrats on the state side. And then, a few years ago, kind of Tea Party happened, and that totally shut everything down. We can't get one Republican vote for a lot of our water bills now. And it's really upsetting and I think sad because it shouldn't be a partisan issue. Clean water should be a bipartisan, priority for everybody. We tell people it shouldn't be a red issue or a blue issue, it's a purple issue. Like everybody needs water, everybody needs to drink water.
The Trump administration has implemented some of the biggest rollbacks for water protection since 1972 when the Clean Water Act was passed. These protections were put in place to safeguard the drinking water for nearly 1/3 of the United States and limit pollution in 60% of waterways. These rollbacks range from stripping away protection on hundreds of acres of wetland and ephemeral streams to relaxing rules and regulations on toxic wastewater discharge from coal plants.
If you want to do what you've been doing, which is, get more worried about the next election instead of the next generation, well then keep doing what you're doing. But then the constituents, young people like you, have got to say that's not acceptable to us anymore. And we've got to go out and start getting elected officials who are actually more concerned about the next generation. And here's the funny part. 9 times out of 10, I'd probably say 99 times out of 100, that same decision, protecting the next generation, is a lot cheaper than not. So for taxpayers who argue that this is ridiculous, you're wasting tax money, no, I'm actually saving you tax money in the long run. And I'm probably building an economy around it. So to say that you're going to either abolish the EPA or you're going to take away the GLRI funds, you're going to pay for it now or you're going to pay for it later.
I guess I was pleasantly surprised at how quickly there was pushback and the funds got restored. I think it showed, this regional unity.
I'm the National Outreach Director for the Young Conservatives for Energy Reform. I have a stereotype that Republicans don't care about clean energy or the environment at all, that the Republicans are, the evil people that are trying to pollute the environment. But, that's not true, clearly. And as we talk to leaders, we do a lot of state and federal, there's a lot of good Republicans out there that want to make this a key issue. Well, I think the stereotype that if you invest in the environment, you'll hurt the economy is wrong. We have seen it's wrong. As I talked about, it's quite frankly the opposite. We're investing in new technologies that the goal is to make energy more abundant and cheaper. And that's better for all workers, for all taxpayers.
It's a trap. It's a political trap. If businesses who are doing bad things to water or air are funding the politicians, they're blocking the emergence of clean technologies. Beyond those sort of simplistic things that this is bad for business, no, it's bad for the businesses that are doing that. They don't want to stop it.
This is really going to be our next big job opportunity. And I'm not talking about just white-collar jobs, blue-collar jobs. These are good jobs that you can build families around. So I think it's really important to say that there's tons of reasons to believe in clean energy. There's tons of reasons why people on our side of the aisle support it. But I think when we get tied on, you need to do it for reason X, Y, or Z, you're missing the opportunity to do a lot of great stuff. This issue has been so politicized that a lot of people will be like, oh, clean energy, it's a Democrat, it's a liberal issue, it's a green activist issue. And that's disappointing, and that's not right, which is why we exist. Because there is an opportunity and a need to inform the right side of the aisle that this doesn't have to be a left-wing issue. It's an America issue.
All right, let's look at these letters, see what kind of questions you guys have. Ella, Joy, they asked if we have seen a bear before.
That's the first question on this one, too.
Well, I have seen a bear before, but we haven't seen any bears on this trip yet.
This trip, neither of us have.
We're kind of hoping to, though, from far away.
How do you go to the bathroom or shower? Outside.
Yeah, we have very natural scenery when we go to the bathroom.
And we have baby wipes for showers.
Have you seen any wolves or coyotes? Well, we've heard coyotes, and we haven't seen any yet in person, but hopefully we'll see some tracks or something. We might hear wolves here in the Porcupine Mountains, so fingers crossed.
I like your picture of the bear cub cabin.
Will you have to walk again to get back home? Thankfully, no. All of our families are coming up here to meet us and take us back. All right, Alyssa, how far have we walked total in our trip?
We are at 332 as of today, so
we made it.
Yeah, our mileage, the 332 miles gets us to the Porcupine Mountains, and now we're doing extra miles within. Where do you get your water and how much do you drink a day? We both try to drink around 2 liters of water a day, but we have water pumps that we filter through the water, so we scoop up from rivers and streams and then we filter it through into our water bottles. Matthew asks, how will we be able to survive for a walk that's over 300 miles long? We've survived off of positive attitude for sure. We've had good weather for the most part, so that's helped us get through it, and having a lot of people supporting us, honestly, because we've been able to keep everybody updated with what we're doing, and it's awesome to hear people and encourage us to keep going.
I agree. Lindsay wants to know what we're most excited about seeing. Well, I think at this point we are most excited about finally seeing Lake Superior, because we walked all this way to see Lake Superior. We haven't seen it yet.
We get to see it tomorrow.
And we get to see it tomorrow.
Thank you guys.
Yeah, thank you guys.
We can't
Thanks,
wait to
Prairie
wear
School.
our stuff.
Yeah, thanks for the blanket.
All right, guys.
Oh, it's going already.
Oh, it is?
Our last night in the woods.
Yep, tomorrow's our last day. And then we get to Lake Superior.
That's weird. It's weird. It's all weird.
I know, we've been living in here for 24 days.
24 days we've been in this little tent.
Yep.
We should show you.
Walking. Yep. Very spacious.
Welcome to our crib.
Over there's our storage cabinets.
Oh, I don't even know if you could see anything, but
no.
It's about as wide as what you see right now.
Yep, our beautiful master bed.
Yeah.
I don't know, how do you feel?
My ankles hurt today, and I think I'm ready to be done. Yeah. It's been a long 24 days, but it's been a long, good 24 days.
Yeah.
But I'm excited to see the lake and to share our story with everybody and show people pictures and talk about what we've learned. And
we've seen some cool stuff.
Yeah.
It's exciting. It's bittersweet.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good word for it, bittersweet, because I'm ready to be done for a little bit, but it's sad at the same time.
It's been nice, like, living outside.
Yeah.
But, yeah. We'll talk more tomorrow.
We're sleepy.
It's cold and rainy, but we won't.
Bye. Bye.
We are literally probably coming on to 2 miles left before we get to Lake Superior.
We've walked for 25 days, all to see Lake Superior.
25 days, over 330 miles.
How am I feeling? Oh, I feel so many different things. It's mind-blowing that we walked this entire way. It's 332 miles. It takes people around 6 hours to just drive here. And I'm just amazed by my body that we did this human-powered, that we walked here on foot the entire way. So good. I feel like humbled by the whole experience. I mean, back in January when this all kind of came to fruition, it came out of a place of anger, honestly. I was pretty frustrated. I felt like we had come into this time where people just didn't care. They didn't care about the environment. Things as simple as water, I felt were being threatened. They still are, in a sense. And I know that things have progressed over the past couple months, but if there's anything that the walk has kind of shown me, and especially making the film, it's given me a lot of hope. And I feel inspired by the things that I've learned on this journey. I've had a lot of time to think about it, think about the interviews we've done, think about the stories that we've heard, and what the Great Lakes and water in general mean to people. I mean, we're sitting in front of one of the largest lakes in the entire world. It's amazing. It's kind of
it doesn't surprise me too much that it's easy for people to take this for granted because it just seems so limitless.
You can't see across this lake right here. You think it's an ocean, but this is all fresh water, and it's mind-blowing that people use this lake and think that we can just treat it however we want without thinking about the consequences of what we're doing to this lake is ultimately affecting us too, because our body has so much water in it, and for those of us who live in the Great Lakes Basin, we consume our Great Lakes water. Whatever we're putting into this lake is essentially we're putting right into our body.
When you think about it, water is just one of the scarcest resources on this planet, and it is one of the very few things that we as humans just can't survive without. And what these Great Lakes give us, I mean, look at where we come from. I'm a Milwaukeean. We live in cities that were built up in these areas because of the Great Lakes, because of water. Ancient cultures, the Native Americans, they saw that, they realized that. That's why we're here. The trees that are around us, that hike that we just took through the state, every minute we spent was in areas that were influenced by what the Great Lakes create and provide. Every fisherman we've talked to, they make their living off of what the Great Lakes provide. So, you know, and there were some people that we talked to that said it's going to take another crisis for there to be change. Like in the 60s and 70s when air and water pollution was so bad, that's when people wanted change because they were angry and they were scared because they were in crisis. Things were that bad. And when I hear that, I would hope that we don't have to get to that point, especially with something like the Great Lakes, something that's so critical to all of us in our everyday survival. Water seems so simple, but I would hope that we can see past that, that we've rehabilitated these lakes and everything to a point where we can continue to improve things, and we don't need to go backwards. You don't need to be a liberal to care about water. You can come from any walk of life and realize that this is so important, and we have to invest in it.